Me, Brandy from Crafting with Brandy. Today I wanted to show you a little bit about ruffles. And for my sewing friends, there's quite a few of you that do ruffles in a different way. So there's a couple options. It always depends on your machine, the type of stitch you can do. And there's different ways that you can pin it to your garment when you're sewing. So the first thing you want to do is create what's called a basting stitch. So you're going to cut your piece of ruffle and get it prepared. And we'll go over like how to prepare your ruffle and sew the seams and do a hem and all of that jazz. But we want to show you just the ruffle part, like how to gather. Different machines have all different types of stitches. Some of yours just have dials. Some of the machines, depending on the brand that you have. I have a Brother machine, a sewing machine. So on my machine, it has lots of different stitch options. My machine in particular has a basting stitch option. It's this one with the long dashes. A basting stitch is essentially just a very long stitch. You're going to want to put it at the top of your piece of fabric and use the basting stitch to help pull and gather the fabric instead of having to fold the fabric yourself and pin it along the garment. You can use a basting stitch to help you gather it evenly. And some people do one basting stitch, some people do two. It depends. Two is like a safety net. So if you're pulling your top stitch and it breaks, you have a second stitch in there to help you out. So what you're going to do is set your sewing machine to either basting stitch, or if you don't have a long basting stitch, you can just use your regular stitch. And you can, if you have a dial, turn the dial so that the length of the stitch is longer. On my machine, I would hit this button that chooses my length of the stitch. And this would be the width of the stitch, like if it was a zigzag stitch, like how high up and down it would go. And this would be the length of the stitch, as in how far apart the needle goes. So I would increase mine to probably like a 4.5 would be a good basting stitch. It would be a long stitch. What I've already done is put a piece of fabric. This is jersey fabric in here. It was just a portion of a pair of pajamas I cut off for somebody. And what you want to do with a basting stitch is you put it in your machine. You want to do it about 1/4 of an inch from the edge that you're going to attach, and baste it through using either of those two stitch options. And you're just going to sew it through. You are not going to back stitch at the beginning. You want to be able to slide the thread back and forth. So if you were to back stitch, you would lock that in place. Some people like to lock their first stitch and then leave the other end open so that they just move one side. Some people just leave it open on both sides and then they tie one end off. For us, I typically just leave both ends open because I'm sewing as fast as I can. So I sewed one whole time from one end, one edge. See, this is sewn together on the side seams. I sewed one whole time all the way to that seam, and then when you get to the end, right before you get to this other side seam, without cutting it, I lift my foot up and pull my thread out, and you can either cut it, or I have a little knife on the side of my machine, a little blade, and I just chop it off so that I have these little strings. Then I would put it back on the machine right past the side stitch, and I would stitch again all the way to the next side stitch and cut it. And I would do that 2 times. So I would end up with, and I don't know if my computer is good enough, but I would end up with a stitch at 1/4 and then another 4th in, so about a 1/2 inch in. So I'd have 2 stitches, and I would end up next to each side seam, I'd have 2 little strings hanging here and 2 little strings that are hanging out here. And then of course you have the back sides of them inside here. It's very careful when you switch over, like when you end one stitch and then you switch to the other side of the side seam to start the next stitch, that you make sure those little strings are out of the way. And when you start your second row, you want to do the same thing. Make sure that you're stitching, that you're not catching those strings when you stitch your second line. That way you can move them. If they get caught in there, you can use your safety net, your seam ripper, to kind of pull them out, like real carefully pull them out. But you want to try hard not to break them. So what you end up with is a piece that looks like this, and it's got these little stitches at the top. Then all you do is on the top side, you find your little strings and you just hold onto your piece of fabric gently and you just pull. You pull those 2 little strings. And like I said, some people like to go to the other end and tie those off so that you can't, because if you pull hard enough, they'll just come out and you'll have 2 strings that fall out of the back and 2 strings that fall out of the front, because all they've done is loop together behind your fabric. So I've pulled it, and as you can see, I've gathered that whole section. And then I would take my piece of fabric and attach it, and I would, as I was pinning it to the fabric, I would smooth these out so that they were consistently gathered along the whole length. Speaking of which, what I like to do is, before I get started, I take my fabric and I would fold it in half, and I would mark the center on both sides. Mark the center. And sometimes if it's a really long piece of fabric, like I made this skirt and it was gathered as well, I would take and mark it maybe another 1/4 of a turn. I would fold it in half again and mark it. And what that does is so that when I'm attaching it to my piece of fabric, your piece of fabric you're attaching it to, whether it be the yoke of a dress or a shirt or whatever you're attaching it to, it is flat. And then the other piece is gathered. And so you need to attach the 2 things together. So what you would do is I would attach the seam to the seam of the piece I'm attaching it to on both sides, and I would find the center of my flat piece and I would attach my center. And then that way I'm working with smaller sections, gathering the fabric between here and here, as opposed to trying to do the entire piece, because then you might be tightly gathered and then you get halfway through and you realize you've run out and then you're not as gathered, and when you finish the product it's really bunched up on one side and not the other. I hope that makes sense. So in this particular case, I'm attaching this skirt to this onesie top to make a little onesie dress. And so you're going to take the right side of this fabric and you're going to attach it to the right side of this fabric, which means your onesie top will have to be, or your product that you're, anything you're sewing it to, your yoke will have to be on the inside. So I would have to put this in and open it up and take the seam of the side of this onesie and my pins and the seam that I've actually ironed and opened up the side seam, and I'm going to pin those 2 things together first. Okay, and then I'm going to go to the other side and pin those 2 sides seams together as well. And then I'm going to find my center, and I'm going to take my skirt, which mine's gathered a little bit, so I'm going to make sure it's even, and attach it to my center, like I mentioned a minute ago. Now all I have to work with gathering is this one small piece. So I'll take all of my little thread and that I have basted in there, and I will move the fabric back and forth on that until it looks symmetrical and my ruffle looks even. And I'll pin it all along here, and I'll go all the way around the piece until it is the skirt is completely attached to this onesie. Put that in my machine. Now, a lot of your patterns are going to tell you then baste it. That would be a 3rd basting. Then to stitch it on top. Then you might be told to zigzag stitch. You might be told to fold the excess, fold the seam allowance up into the onesie and stitch it down so that it's nice and smooth. There's lots of different versions. It depends on what your pattern tells you to do at that point. In this particular case, I am going to stitch it all the way around. I'm not going to baste it ahead of time. Once you get more comfortable with sewing, I think you can skip that step. You just go around the entire thing and sew it. I'm going to try hard not to pull too tight because this is a stretchy jersey type material, and so I don't want it to be wrinkled or pulled and tugged around the waist. But I'm going to be covering this seam up with this nice piece of stretchy elastic, so the beauty of the very top doesn't matter so much. It just needs to be adhered properly. So I hope that helped clarify a little bit about ruffles, tell you a little bit about how to do a basting stitch and how to ruffle product. There are ruffle foots that you can attach, and by a click of a button, you create your own ruffle and it automatically gathers it for you, but you have to know approximately how gathered you want it to be. It's a little bit more advanced. There's lots of different ways. We'll talk later about how to actually cut a ruffle if you decide you want to add a ruffle to a pair of jeans or something like that for a young girl, or a pair of shorts that wasn't already there, about how you would approximate the length of your ruffle, how to hem and attach it, how it's to be cut. It's typically just a rectangle and double length of whatever the width of your product is in order to get a good, cute little ruffle. I hope that this helps. I hope you learned something new, and if you ever need anything or have any questions, you know who to call. Crafting with Brandy. Thanks, and have a fantastic rest of the day.